Well, guys, thanks for coming out. Let's have some fun tonight. All right. So I'm just going to start. I'm going to give you a layup to start with here. We'll just start with Chris and we'll work down. What made you fall in love with motorsports? And then why'd you pursue it as a career?
Oh, Lord.
And we're going to share the mics there, Chris. We're not going to be strangers tonight. Flip it up there.
I could probably do it without it.
There we go.
There we go. Can you hear me? Yeah. No, I, grew up on a racetrack road, and I got to kind of witness a lot of things that happened. I got to sit out in the front yard and watch all these haulers go down. And, I got to be a part of, just the excitement of race week. People don't realize when everybody comes into town and visit it, not only does it help the economic side of the city, but there's a lot of characters and people in the sport. And I got to meet some of those characters as I was growing up and, seeing the difference back in the day between modifieds and sportsmen and Grand National, it intrigued my interest, and then along the way, my dad went to work for the racetrack and me and Clay got to play around in the street a lot back in the day. And so I got to go do things at the racetrack that a lot of people couldn't do. And I fell in love with it. Not only just, the back support of it, it didn't matter if it was souvenirs or concessions or cleaning up on the track or whatever. I mean, Clay let me drive the pace car. I flagged. I've done pretty much everything at the racetrack you can do. And then I met this guy named Dale Earnhardt, and it kind of changed everything. And so I realized that was the path I wanted to do. And it was the best choice for me and my family. And I'm not going to look back. So it's been fun.
All right. Hey, Satch, before you get into it, you mind just doing a quick introduction with your name and kind of the history in the sport?
Well, I'm Satch Worley. Kind of got a problem through this.
That's all right.
Live in Rocky Mount. Been around racing here for about 100 years, I guess. But we're still here, but we're not doing much racing now. So that's about the long and short of it.
All right. Yeah, we'll pass on down.
Sure. Remember what's the question?
No problem. What made you fall in love with motorsports, and then why'd you pursue it as a career?
Well, my path was probably easier than some of the other guys on the panel here that eventually realized what they wanted to do. My grandfather, Clay Earl, started Martinsville Speedway. So, and as most of you in here probably know, this is our 75th anniversary. So been around a long time. And I knew right away that when I was old enough to understand what was going on, that was the life I wanted to be a part of. Now, did I want to be in the office sitting at a desk running the operation? Not really. I wanted to drive a race car like Satch, and that was my desire at the time. But I know what side of the fence I belong on, and I'm on the right side. But that got my career started, just being in the family, and been in it ever since. I've been president since 1988, and love what I do. So I'm very fortunate.
Pass it on to Rhett Vandiver down here next. Yeah.
My name's Rhett Vandiver. I am a second generation driver, driven a little bit. My dad's name was Jim Vandiver. Most of my stories are about my dad. And how did I fall in love with the sport? I kind of was forced to, because I was born into a racing family. So I have been a competitor's son. I've been a pit crew member. I've been a marketing director for a cup team. I've worn a lot of hats and done a lot of things in racing, and I still love the sport. I'm still a huge fan. People ask me who my favorite driver is, and other than Satch Worley, other than that, I say I don't really have a favorite driver. There's some I'm not too crazy about, but I love the sport and love to see the best in the sport. And Martinsville has done a fantastic job. I love that Martinsville's on the schedule, and twice a year we get to see people beat and bang fenders. Thanks.
And our final panelist is Warrick Scott. So Warrick, give us the rundown of how you kind of got roped in all this.
Oh man, I was born in it, if you will. My grandfather is the NASCAR legend Wendell Scott. We hail from Danville, Virginia. And so I was born into a racing culture and a racing family. My father is Frank Scott, who legendary high school basketball coach from out in this area in Martinsville, Virginia. But he was also my grandfather's crew chief and had been working in his pits since he was a young man. So much like Clay, I I know where I need to fit in at. I'm more involved with the executive aspects of my grandfather's legacy and the licensing and the branding and things of that nature. But what I'm most proud of is that we have the Wendell Scott Foundation, which is a nonprofit that is founded in honor of my late grandfather and grandmother, Mary Scott. And we utilize STEM education and iRacing and cultural enrichment to try to level the playing field for the youth of Southside Virginia.
All right. Well, we'll just stay with you, Warrick. What's some of the race day traditions that your family had that you've heard of, maybe from your father, your grandfather? What were some of their traditions they had?
Well, one thing was when my grandfather was racing, his mother she had the ability to, she could look down in the wild grass and she could pluck a 4-leaf clover. And so every race he went to when she was alive, she would tape she would send a 4-leaf clover with him and he would tape it to his dash. And so that's one family tradition. And then obviously the food was a big tradition. Unfortunately for my family, during my grandfather's NASCAR career, especially in the 50s and the 60s, they were not allowed to stop and get food or get gas or even oftentimes stay in hotels. And because of that, we had to be rather crafty in how we packed our foods, our beverages, our concessions, but it birthed some of the greatest meals, anybody could know. So country ham biscuits, potato salad, fried chicken, anything that kept, it was in the car as they were traveling.
All right. Rhett, let's come to you. Same question there. Any unique traditions that your family had?
It's funny he mentioned, was your mother or your grandmother? My grandmother used to pack an incredible spread for race day. And what I remember more than anything was the iced tea, because it was half iced tea and half grape juice. If you've never tried it, wonderful. I do Arnold Palmer's all the time, but that was the best tea. The other thing I remember is always being late. My dad was notoriously late. And I remember one time in particular at Daytona, we were in a 10-passenger van, and there was some dispute, and NASCAR drivers are habitually hot-headed, and some guy behind, he cut him off or something. And so there was going to be a controversy, a physical controversy. So I was sitting in the back of the van. My dad was driving, he gets out. My brother was in the passenger seat, he gets out. My grandfather was in the middle seat, he gets out. Everybody going like, well, we'll show them. I'm in the back. I was probably 15. I start climbing over seats and I go out. And by the time I got to the other truck, there were two mean looking guys. It was over. And they said, well, we don't want to fight. My family was back in the van. I'm out there by myself. And these guys said, what do you want? I'm like, nothing. I'm good. But there's always something going on the racetrack.
Clay, when you wake up Sunday morning, what's the tradition on race day?
Gosh, I was trying to think as work and yeah, but I can't think of anything that would be a true tradition. I go back to when I was a kid, and my mother worked at the Speedway, my aunt, my sister, the whole family worked there, as Chris knows, and we lived probably 5 miles from the track. So family got there really early. I mean, like we do now, 5 o'clock in the morning. Well, I'm not going at 5 o'clock in the morning when I'm a kid. So they had to send somebody back over to pick me up to bring me back to the track early in the morning or later early in the morning. But probably some of you have seen pictures of me and my grandfather. At that time, he wore a red blazer, kind of like I've got on now with the Speedway logo on it. And I had one just like it. So I was his little, whatever you want to call it, but looked just like him. So I've tried to collect all those pictures that I could find and destroy them, but there's still a few floating around that I've threatened people's lives with. But anyway, that's about it.
Satch, did you have any traditions on race day?
Well, yeah, it's, I guess I started, my dad used to take me to races, from the time I was knee high, we'd go to South Boston, Bowman Gray, everywhere in this part of the country, and I don't know how I got into it, but, when I turned like 18, I started helping different ones around the county there to get into it, you know. First thing you know, I was in it, and we got to go into all the races. You know, I first drove William Mason from up here to Oak Level. You know, he was one of the old timers, and he was about like a second dad to me. You know, we from the time that I got to drive for him, we were traveling. I mean, we were going up, you know, Northeast, New Jersey, New York, everywhere. You know, it wasn't just local, but I guess we had good enough luck or whatever, and William had some good cars back then, and everything just sort of continued on. But we were pretty much travelers, you know, from the word go, and I guess we did that until I guess my last NASCAR race was '99. So we've been on the road a lot. You know, it's I mean, I grew up in my dad's construction business, you know, so we just sort of worked 4 or 5 days and then raced for the other 3 days, you know, and we got back in time to go to work again on Monday. But, it was a good life, you know. We just didn't, I mean, that was just a given, you know. Then we didn't, you know, we weren't set up to do the racing thing like people are now. You know? So we just raced for a lot of different people, you know, with actually all the top people in this part of the county, you know, it's part of the state. But you know, drove for Clarence Steakhouse for 7 or 8 years, and then it was just everybody. And you know, we actually were lucky enough to win some races, and just stayed out of trouble, and you know, made the best of it. And it was a good life. You know, we enjoyed everything we did and had some success. And, you know, I guess that's about all you want.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, Chris, let's come to you now. I know you've done a little bit of everything, but what's the tradition?
Well, I probably need to give Clay some money, because when I first started, when I was younger, I used to jump the fence to hold the seats on the back stretch. So it's so that is true story, because back in the double header days before the triple headers, I mean, if you didn't get there when the gates open, you weren't going to get a seat. And so I would always, Mom and them would get me a blanket, and I'd go down at 5:30, jump the fence, and save the top row. So appreciate you seeing me doing it. Turn two. That's a true statement. So that was my tradition, is to sneak in the racetrack. Sorry, but you know, as Clay said, when you grew up in the sport, you know, you have to do it all, and it doesn't matter what it is. In Clay's world or my world or any of these worlds, you find that, you know, you're a master of none, but you learn how to do it all. And so the traditions, not only in licensing and souvenirs, you know, my thing was to make sure, you know, we were prepared, you know, for souvenirs. We were prepared for the licensing side, for the fans, because people don't realize, everybody even sitting on this panel, is if one thing goes wrong, or if Clay runs out of hot dogs, that's tradition everybody should have, by the way. But if he runs out of hot dog, he's going to hear it. You know, if Satch has a bad race, fans going to hear it. You know, if everything's not prepared, people don't realize it affects everybody here. So you're part of the cog that goes on. And so everybody has to be on their game. And so the tradition is just to make sure that we prepared the best we could. And then I'll keep it short because I could go on. One of the cool things is when I was working for Earnhardt, he'd always go to bed about 9:30 and get up about 3:30, 4 o'clock and start signing autographs. Well, he'd always call me every night. And the tradition on race day was he would always call to see how much money, we called it cabbage, that he had earned. And he was 70% of the industry back in the day. And so it was cool that he would run a race, sometimes win, sometimes wreck, some whatever, but he'd call me every single Sunday night and we would have a chat about what transpired during the day from sales standpoint to business to traffic to racing. And it was a good debrief. And I look forward to those days.
Well, let's just stay here with you, Chris, on that topic, because I knew you had a special friendship with Dale. We remember Dale on the track, right? Remember the competitor he was. What kind of person was he off the track? And then what were some of the things he was into that a lot of people may not know?
Well, I mean, Dale is just like every one of us. We're competitors to a certain nature, right? And because we want to strive to be the best that we can. And Earnhardt was the same way. I mean, everything he done, it didn't matter if it was fishing. It didn't matter if the airplane had to be the fastest. It didn't matter what he touched. He had to have the best of the best. And gravitate towards that. And so he was just a fierce competitor. He loved hunting. We went every year. It's funny nowadays when you win the championship, you got to go to New York, you got to, go here and there. Well, Dale told NASCAR, I'm going 5 days hunting. I'll see you on Thursday. So it would delay all of the celebration throughout all the, internet, all the other stuff that was going on, but he went and hunted. And so he loved it. He loved farming. He loved working. He had, a lot of people don't know, he had basically a farm of deer on his farm, 400 some acres, and he raised deer. I mean, I could probably tell you some bad stuff. Like one time he flew up to Iowa, put a deer in a plane. They're like, how did you get a deer in a plane? They tranquilized it. And so we flew it back. Well, the deer woke up about 20 minutes from landing. So we had to stay on top of him and tackle him until we get landed. Now, to anybody that knows anything about game, you're not supposed to transport game across the line. So that was probably a lie. Allegedly. So, but Dale was so much fun. But, the cool thing is everybody sitting here, and it's funny because I know most everybody on this panel, I know your dad, because, I told you when I met you, I mean, I would play for Jerry Mason, and I have a lot of respect for your dad, just a tremendous amount, to be perfectly honest with you. And we always sit at the Hall of Fame together when and I just love him. Clay, sitting here, I can't say enough about Clay. Just from a young age, he was probably the youngest person in the NASCAR world to run a track, and he learned from his granddad tremendously how to do it. And I still to this day says everybody needs to look at Clay and them of how they manage their tracks. It's just superb. And I'll say this about Satch, because he was my racing hero growing up. And I always, no matter where Satch was running in the 26 or the 07 or the 4 or whatever, Satch was the gauge for me in a modified world, which kind of brings me to where I am today, of owning the Smart Modified Tour. But a lot of it is because of what these guys have basically influenced me and your dad. So, I just want to say appreciate it to everybody. Thank you very much.
Rhett, I'm going to come to you with this one. Doing my research here, I ran across a very famous moment your father had at Darlington Speedway. So for everyone in the audience, let us know that moment and give us your side of the story on that.
Actually, I was the cause of that particular instance. My parents were divorced, and my mother had custody of me, but I ran away and lived with my dad. So they were trying to serve papers on my dad for custody of me. And they came to the garage area first, and they talked to Bill Gazaway at the time. He was an inspector, and they said, we need to get this guy. We need to arrest him. They said, or at least serve papers. They said, look, let him run the race. Just let him run the race. You can get him after the race. He's not going to go anywhere. They said, okay. So during the race, there are 2 uniformed police officers in our pits. So one of the most memorable thing is my uncle, back then they didn't have radio communication. My uncle had the pit board, and he wrote a big LAW on the pit board and was showing it as Dad went around. Well, he figured out what was happening. So the car was running worse and worse. It was the engine was getting ready to fail. So he said, I didn't know if the crew saw it or not, but the last lap he went by the pits, he said, see ya, boys. Went down to 1 and 2, went down the backstretch and spun out going into the 3. And here's what someone told me the radio broadcast was. And Jim Vandiver spins out going into turn 3 to breeze out the day's 4th caution. Now, here at Darlington Speedway, we have, and Jim Vandiver's going over the wall. They thought he had heat stroke or something. He spun out, got out of his car, ran across the track and went down. He said, it's crazy inside the track. So many people. He said, outside the track, it's like a ghost town. And it was lucky. He said, right where he went, someone had snuck in. Sorry, Clay, snuck in and the fence was down so he could, or up, he could go under the fence. He hitched a ride. My uncle was distraught and he said, oh, I know he's locked up. I know for sure. Well, he called and paged him from the garage area. He said, man, I'm at home having a beer watching football. Nothing got to my dad. And one other thing, since he started it about allegedly one time, it wasn't at Martinsville, but allegedly one time, me and my brother were checking out my dad's trunk of his car at Metrolina and went into the track. And then my dad popped the trunk and we got out. And it just so happened that Donnie Allison was also there at a race and he saw us emerge from the trunk and he's never let us forget that. So funny. Pop the trunk and two teenagers get out of the, so things happened.
I like that. Clay, I'm taking notes of how to sneak in on Sunday. I know, right? Yeah. Clay, can you give us your best Clay Earl story?
There are numerous ones, but Chris is involved with this one. You know, I told you, since I grew up on the business side of it, and I really wanted to do the racing side of it, I got my first go-kart when I was probably 6 years old, just a go-kart from Sears, actually. And probably these guys here had one too, but he allowed us to have go-karts at the Speedway. Me and a good friend of mine, Chris, was involved with it. It was about 4 or 5 of us. And one of my good buddies from school, we appointed him to be the flagman. Actually, we had 3 different tracks within the Speedway. We had a short track, and that was 4 lines long on the front stretch. So the outside wall was the front stretch and the pit wall was the back stretch. This is a good track. Then we had an intermediate size track down in the infield. So we did a different track every time. But the guy that I had doing the flagging, he wasn't there to throw a caution if we had a wreck or something like that. He was there to throw a caution if he saw Granddaddy coming through the gate up there watching us, because he didn't want us racing. He made it clear, you can ride, but don't race. Well, we're not going to go down there and ride. We're going to race. And, Chris, you remember Ray Powell? He had a car, and this was back in the day of Cale Yarborough and the Holly Farms car, yellow and that pukey color, yellow and whatever. And he had a Cale Yarborough sticker on his back bumper. So we'd go down the straightaways just scrubbing that back bumper, trying to take the Cale Yarborough sticker off of it. But we had a great time. But that was one thing that he was adamant against. In fact, that went through, you know, when I grew up, I did some racing and he was adamant against it. He said, and I'll tone this down, if I ever catch you in a race car, I'll kick your you-know-what to the moon. And if you think about it, he was involved in racing from the very beginning. So probably a lot of his friends didn't make it. He lost a lot of friends during that time. So he certainly didn't want me doing it. He had a game plan for my life, and it wasn't sitting behind the wheel of a race car. So I had numerous, when I was racing go-karts, I would change my name when I went someplace. When I ran stock cars and I ran Caraway, it was something to go in his office on Monday morning and get chewed out. I mean, he ran me really good. I worked for him, and he was probably harder on me than anybody else. And I didn't understand it then. I understand it now. And Warrick, you're probably the same way. And Rhett, you understand. But I remember he caught me one time sleeping in a wheelbarrow after lunch in the maintenance shop. That didn't turn out too good. For those of you that are familiar with the track, we were the first ones to put concrete in the turns. And Satch, you remember that. So first lane was concrete, and we did that by hand. We didn't have machinery to do it, and 2 of these hands participated in putting it down. And there I was right out of school. I was always a scrawny little run anyway, and I didn't, pushing that screed and float and all that stuff, pushing that concrete was tough. And the guy that was on the other side of it, he was a big brute, Clarence. You remember Clarence? Yeah. So he was over there, and his arms were flabbing as he was pushing the 2x6. It was about 12 feet long. So I knew he wasn't pushing it hard. I was doing all the work. here comes Granddaddy riding up in his Pontiac. He rolls the window down. It was hot as you know what, and he had the air conditioning on. He rolls the window down. He's like, Clarence, don't let him ride that thing. There I was pushing my guts out, and he was getting on my case. But it was, you know, he taught me a lot, and that was fun. But I ran Daytona and Talladega the last few years that I drove a race car, and I told my crew chief, I said, I got to get home and go over to Roselawn and pay up, because I know he's spinning in his grave knowing that I'm running places like that. But he hated it. So
That's
I
great.
survived though.
Warrick, I'm gonna come to you next, and I'm gonna preface this question by saying save the Jacksonville Speedway story. But what's one of the best stories you have on your grandfather there?
Okay. Couple of stories. Allegedly, I'll do allegedly. Let's talk moonshine. My grandfather, naturally, for those who don't know, was like many of the guys, he was a bootlegger. He was a pretty good one too. There's a section in Danville called Fall Creek. It was most notably called the Fall Creek Whiskey Run. It's a snake road, real tight. He was hauling moonshine one night. Had a roadblock set up for him at the end of this snake road. And so he threw his moonshine car in reverse with the police chasing them, backed out through the snake road. He got to the top of the road, threw it in a 180, spent off, took off through Danville. He didn't go to his garage that the law enforcement knew about. He had a secret garage. He went to a secret garage, and he snatched the engine out of the car. Police showed up to our home house, wrote him a citation, chastised him. We know it was you. We know it was you. In those days, Danville had night court. So he had to go to night court. And the law enforcement was in there, and they were saying, you know, Wendell, we caught Wendell. He was hauling the moonshine, and Wendell was saying, my grandfather was saying, well, that wasn't me. I don't know who you're talking about. Long story short, the judge says, and this is in a documentary called Scott. Okay, this is produced by, narrated by Senator John Warner. The judge says, also, let me add in my story to authenticate my story. Allegedly, they interviewed a gentleman named Homer Price, who was actually the policeman that was chasing them that night. He's passed away since then. And the judge told them, next time you bring Wendell in my courtroom, I want you to bring him and the engine. and they sent him back out. And then my last story, real quick story, just to show you my grandfather's impact. On the way to a Martinsville race one year, coming through Charlotte, coming through Greensboro. I got a brand new Yukon Denali. Man, I'm gunning and I'm flying. I get a speeding ticket. Me and my wife together get a speeding ticket. So state trooper takes my driver's license registration, walks back to his car, does his thing, comes back to me, looks at my last name. He says, Scott. He said, you're not related to the Scotts out of Danville, are you? And I said, I got a little embarrassed. I said, yes, sir. Wendell's my grandfather. He said, really, Wendell's your grandfather? I said, yes, sir. He says, step out the car for a minute. Look at my wife. My wife is looking at me like she's like, don't get out of the car, don't get out of the car. He gets me out of the car. He asked me to come back to his police car. And he pops the glove box, and he shows me that he used to be in Richard Petty's pit crew. And he actually had a picture of my grandfather with him. And so he didn't give me a ticket. I wish my wife was here, but what he did do was, he said, so you like to drive fast, huh? I said, well, I just was trying to get to the race. I'm trying to get to the race. And so he gave me a police escort. And he dropped me off right where the North Carolina Virginia line is. And we were probably going a good 9,500 miles per hour when I was following the police car.
Allegedly, right?
There you go. Allegedly. So that's my little story.
That's great. Satch, being from Rocky Mount, when you raced at Martinsville, were you more motivated when you raced there compared to any other track? That's great. So technology is a big part of motorsports, and pushing that technology to the limit for a competitive advantage is a big part too. So I'll just open it up and anybody can jump in here, just kind of wave at me. I'll let you. What's some of the craziest legal and illegal things you've seen a team use to try to win a race? You want to jump in there first, Satch? Go ahead.
I always ran illegal. Anyway.
Said every race car driver ever.
No, it's, I guess, the most illegal stuff was back, in the early days, they just didn't have the technology or whatever, but when you came to a place like Martinsville or whatever, you pretty well towed the line. So I'm sure it's been a whole lot of things that was pushed through there, but I guess we never were in a position to do that with some of the cars we ran down there. But over the years, it's been a lot of stuff, and I can't really remember anything that we actually got away with that would have made a difference. We people I drove for, whatever, we just I guess did good to get there with what was supposed to be legal, and we just made the best of it. But I don't really know of anything that I can recall that was way out of line there.
Anybody else have anything? Rhett?
Something to add. My dad drove the number 31 Dodge back when Richard Petty, David Pearson in particular was driving. And at that time, you could not block off the front radiator because it gave you too much of an aero advantage. So they're always watching the competitors. This actually isn't against my dad, it's against someone else. They always watch all the competitors. So as they were going through inspection, he was watching the 21 car with an eagle eye. Then the 31 comes in, and the guy has this coat hanger. He sticks through the grill, and Daddy said, whoa, you don't need to do that. You didn't do it to the number 21. And the inspector said, look, this is the number 31. You just worry about this car. So the easiest way to cheat is to pay off an official. Just saying. And another one wasn't really cheating, but my dad, back in the day, they ran really small spoilers, like a 1-inch spoiler on his Dodge. He was at Talladega and he was running, and he said, I bet I could run faster if we take that spoiler off. And my uncle's like, I think that's a bad idea. He said, I can handle it. So we went out qualifying, and I think practice for qualifying. I'm not sure. First lap, he made it. He was like 2-3 miles an hour faster. Second lap, he spun out. He said he put like a $50 dent in the right quarter panel. Came in, my uncle just shaking his head said, you're crazy. So there's always, back in the day, there was a lot less technological. The inspection process was much easier, and there was a huge gray area. So there was a lot of creative engineering that went on. I'm sure Wendell didn't have anything.
Yeah, I have one. My grandfather used to sometimes buy things for his race car from other NASCAR drivers that were sponsored. When they would change the cars, he would swoop in and get a good car, take it back to the shop, modify it. And so he tells me the story of how he gets a car from an unnamed NASCAR driver, whom I will not name, and he is modifying the inside of the car, and he has to do some welding, and he cuts the roll cage. And as he cuts the roll cage, all of these fabricated metal beads start falling out of the roll cage. So I think they can tell you all that. I think it's a certain threshold where you're not supposed to have those metal beads fabricated, but somebody had some tricks in tow. He just didn't know he didn't know the trick was rigged. But that's a story that I remember him telling us. And then when he would run his moonshine cars, he came back from the war. He served in General Patton's army in the Red Ball Express. So he picked up a lot of interesting tricks like nitrous oxide. He had two gas tanks on his car. He had a toggle switch that would short his brake light out. So when the police were chasing him at night, he could flip his brake light off and they wouldn't know if he was going left or right. So some of the stuff that he was up to.
I've seen several things here. As Rhett pointed out, the inspection process now is much more stringent. You don't get away with much, and when you do, you really get the heavy hammer laid on you. But back in the day, when I worked on the maintenance department at the track, every afternoon or after a race, we'd sweep the track, and down at the bottom of the track against the curb, you couldn't imagine all the BBs that were laying against the curb. And what those BBs were, the inspection process before the race was different than after. So you had to be X amount on your ride height. After the race, it didn't matter. So what they did, they put BBs in a little package and put it in the spring. So the car would go through the sticks and it would be the right height. Well, the first time they dove off into turn one at speed, it busted that bag and the BBs came out. So you're down on the bottom. I mean, they've always been smarter than the NASCAR officials anyway. That's what they do. Another thing, when they were pushing the cars up to line them up before the race, the crew would be behind the car pushing on the spoiler, and whoever was sitting in there steering it, when they got where they're going, they'd jam on the brakes, and that pushed the spoiler up. So again, that gave them an advantage. The spoiler had a different angle, so it made a big difference. How many of you remember Marty Robbins, the country music singer? I know many of you do. I remember one time at Talladega, he was passing everybody. I mean, he ran for fun. He loved racing, and he ran select races, usually the big tracks like Talladega. And this was back when Wendell was running, but he was passing everybody just like they were going backwards. When the race was over, they nailed him for his carburetor was much, much, much bigger than anybody else's, and it wasn't legal. And I said, Marty, why did you even do that? He said, I wanted to see what it felt like to pass Richard Petty.
Yeah, before Junior Johnson passed away here a few years ago, I got to spend a whole day with him talking about this, and some of you bringing up some of the things that's already been said. I know he brought up one time when Darrell Waltrip won to Winston and he blew the motor going by the start finish line. He told Darrell to, rev it up, blow it. And Darrell's like, why? We got to race it. He said, do it. And he blew it up because he knew the motor was illegal and they couldn't inspect it when it was blown up. And so I remember a lot of those stories. And, he actually brought up the whole Fireball Roberts at Charlotte. He got in a fire, and he died, burn up. But the reason is because back then they were putting fuel in the roll cages, and he had a wreck in the second lap of the race. And Junior said that, the fuel ignited, and that's what burnt Fireball, up and passed. So, I mean, they were going to the extremes to have that advantage because, as Clay and everybody knows, I mean, you want anything you can. And I know somebody, I won't mention any names, but somebody won a prestigious race by going like 12 more miles than everybody else at a big race. And ironically, that person told me that they had fuel in the fire extinguisher. So they had run a line up to the carburetor and nobody checked an inspection, and they had the fuel in the fire extinguisher. And that's what gave them the 11 laps to win. So it goes on. It happens. I mean, heck, we in the modified world, we had something happen in the last couple of weeks, but every driver out there is looking for an advantage, and they're going to do a lot to get it done. And the drivers know nothing about them. I get that, but those crew are doing everything they can to bend the rules to make it work. So it happens.
I got one more at Junior Johnson to show you how deviously genius he was. People watch what people do, and Junior Johnson's cars always ran well. This was like in the late 80s. He would intentionally buy parts from a vendor, and people would find out, he was like secret. He'd buy these parts knowing they were substandard parts so that people would buy their parts from them and their engines would break. When secretly he bought them from another vendor and didn't let anybody know he was running X brand instead of Y brand. That's how devious these guys were. Brilliant.
That's great. That is great. So Clay, I'm gonna come to you. Martinsville's not just a good racetrack. It also has one of the best trophies in sports. And winners of the race have been receiving a grandfather clock from Ridgeway Clocks for years now. How did that tradition become about, and why do you think it's become one of the most desired trophies in motorsports?
That started, my grandfather actually started that one in 1964. In fact, Fred Lorenzen he won the first race that gave a clock. And that particular clock is in the Martinsville Speedway display at the NASCAR Hall of Fame. So it's still around. David Reagan owns that clock now, but they loaned it to us to put in there. At the time when that tradition got started, and it was never intended to be such an iconic trophy or even a tradition. It just, Granddaddy wanted something special for the drivers, not just a regular old cup or, chrome looking trophy. And Ridgeway Clock was just down the road, 3 miles, 4 miles, something like that. And they built those grandfather clocks. So we hooked up with them and started giving clocks away. I think now it's got to be the most cherished and sought after trophy in all of motorsports. It's funny, Mike Skinner, who was a really good racer in the truck series, we didn't always give it to every division that ran at Martinsville. It was always mainly for the Cup guys. Now, obviously, the double headers with Modified and Sportsman, they got them. But as far as Saturday races and things like that, we didn't. Then we changed it. Well, if you win Martinsville, you need to get a clock. And that's what we did. So Mike Skinner won the last race that we didn't give a clock. So every time I see him, he harps on me. I can't say what he says, but he's ill that he didn't get a clock. So, we've got these little replica identical clocks. So I'm going to give him one of those sometimes. And here's your clock. But that's how that got started. It's kind of like the hot dog. It's you don't talk to somebody too long about Martinsville where you don't mention the clock or the hot dog. Neither one was intended to be what it is now. But, thankfully, we have something with a clock and an iconic signature product like, some stadiums do. So pretty fortunate with that.
All right. You got something, Satch? Go ahead.
Yeah, I got a clock, but that's a pretty big fight there for a while. We the guy that I was driving for in Connecticut was racing down here when I started, and he, actually he worked on his car up here at William Mason's garage when we were here during the week. And I'd known him for years, but anyway, we got together and I'd never won a race over there when they were giving everybody a clock until I was driving his car in, what was that, 91, I guess. 92. Yeah, 90. And you could see him. He just green around the gills there, when they came up with that thing, and he kept making comments, and I said, well, I've been racing down here about as long as you have. I'm gonna get the first one. And he never did give it up, but actually he ended up getting one because Donnie Lee or somebody wrote. He told Donnie before the race, if we win this race, that's my clock. So we got one, and then proud of it.
Awesome. So before electronic scoring became about, a lot of times there were some races where the scoring was questioned. So I know two down here at the end have a couple of stories. So Warrick, let's start with you and talk a little bit about your grandfather's victory in Jacksonville that was taken away, and then it's since come back and NASCAR acknowledged it just the other year.
Yeah. So my grandfather, December 1st, 1963, he became the first African-American team owner or driver to win in a Cup Series race. You were talking about ingenuity earlier. So what some people don't realize is the way he was able to achieve that victory was he actually he de-shocked his car. He put you all can correct me if I'm wrong here. There are certain shocks on the car that are more flexible. I think it's the rear shocks. So when he was qualifying, he recognized that Jacksonville Speedway at the time is no longer there. It's been torn down. He recognized that there were lots of potholes and dips in the track. And so he changed the shock system in order for him to be able to absorb the bumps during the race. And a lot of the other drivers were hitting those potholes and stuff and cars falling all apart. And so he was able to, de-shock his car that way. During that race, whether intentional or unintentional, he actually lapped the entire field. NASCAR says he lapped the field twice. My grandfather says he lapped the field 3 times. But whatever the case may be, at the end of the race, he was not awarded his victory because of, we'll just say, traditions of the time. He was not awarded his victory. He did receive his purse, but it wasn't until all of the fans and everyone was gone. But, his legacy, persevered beyond that moment. He was highly prolific in the 60s. 61 and 66, he finished 3rd in NASCAR for point standings, for ownership. He won 128 sportsman and modified races before he began the race cup. He was the Virginia Sportsman of the Year in 1953. And so, it's sometimes back in those days, without the benefit of technology, it's kind of hard to keep up with those laps sometimes, with excitement and different things that happen. But whatever the case may be, I think he put a little extra sauce on it. So like I said, he went around 2 extra laps just to make sure, that his victory was solidified. So we're real proud. We're real proud of that.
Rhett, I'm gonna come to you. Your father's best finishing cup was a runner-up at Talladega, if my research is right. But I know
he won that race.
There's some controversy surrounding it. Yeah. So for those who don't know what I'm talking about, give us your side of the story there.
This was the first race ever at Talladega. They had a big problem with the tires separating or blowing out. So at the time, there was a drivers union, the Professional Drivers Union Association, PDA, and a lot of the named drivers boycotted the Talladega race. Because of that, my uncle was working for Ray Fox. I think Buddy Baker was their driver at the time. I'm not sure about that. But once the other drivers boycotted it, my dad got the opportunity to drive Ray Fox's number 3 Dodge. Dominated the race, led tons of laps. Here's the kicker. And by the way, scoring back in the day, because I've been a scorer too, they had a numeral clock, a digital clock. And as your car came by, you wrote the number down. And they'd have to go back and check all the scoring, all the different people. So if they're not looking at it, you can just keep doing the same lap times. If it's 30 seconds a lap, you just keep writing that number down regardless of where your car is. There's ways you can do it. What happened during that race? My dad, every time he pitted, was under caution. When Richard Brickhouse, who won the race, they say, when he pitted, 2 or 3 times he pitted under green. The gist of it was Richard Brickhouse was in the new Dodge Daytona with the nose and the wing on the back. My dad was in an old Charger 500. And we think, because NASCAR was in with the factories, they wanted a Dodge Daytona to win the first ever Talladega race. So how it came down was Brickhouse was faster. He passed my dad. Our contention was he was getting back in the lead lap. NASCAR said that was the pass for the win. They gave Brickhouse the win. And the ramifications are huge because my dad raced for several years after that. He didn't retire till 83. Had he won, no telling what, I've heard the Petties looked at him as a driver. The Wood brothers actually looked at him for a driver at one point. If he had raced, that would have put me in a race car. I mean, it would have been huge for our family, but yes, we still dispute that to this day.
Jog my memory. Historical factoid, Jacksonville 200, that race counted for the 1964 Cup season, even though it happened in 63. And I just was on the phone with Jim Campbell from Chevy just the other day, and I reminded him that was Chevy's only victory as a manufacturer that entire NASCAR season. But what Rhett is saying also applies to us. There's a book on my grandfather called Hard Driving. In it, he talks about having meetings with Lee Iacocca, and he was told that if he put forth a good showing during that 63 season, that he would be able to finally attain sponsorship. And so he went out and won. But because his victory was not celebrated and acknowledged, it actually scared away other sponsors because they felt like every time he won, that it would be the same dynamic. And so I say that to point out that, the entire sport of NASCAR itself has evolved tremendously. There's still a lot more to do, absolutely, but the sport has evolved itself tremendously, from now to then. So, and Martinsville has played a huge role in my family's legacy. I tell people when we do interviews and stuff like that, that's our home gymnasium. You know what I mean? And so 75 years to the day this weekend, I mean, what a contribution, to our area in the South Side. So although it may not be time for that, I just say kudos to you and your family for our contribution. And Jesse Jones is historically from Danville. The Jesse Jones family is from Danville, and I think it's great synergy.
Well, I'm gonna come back for some hot dog questions here in a little bit. So, but let's start with you, Clay. This weekend gets kicked off Thursday night with the modified. So, what do you think makes a modified race in Martinsville so special?
Modifieds have always been my favorite tour by far. For those of you that are not familiar with the modifieds, you need to come out Thursday and watch them. They've always been the most powerful. Now with the next gen cup car, I'm not sure if some of these stats are still true with the wider tire that the next gen car has, but at one point, just think about this: a much wider tire than a cup car, a lot more horsepower, and half the weight. So put all those components together and you've got a fast race car. They've always been the fastest cars that run at Martinsville. I mean, for a long time. And I know since the issues we had back in the 80s, they did do a few things to actually slow them down. Not really a restrictor plate, but the carburetor and the gear ratio and things like that. They didn't want them running as fast as they were. And at the time we had those problems, it was actually the car that was a problem. But we've clocked them doing 130 down the straightaway. Now that, excuse me, that is flying for a race car. But you stand, there's nothing that's more special than standing close to them when they fire up for the start of the race. I mean, it just rumbles in your chest, and it's always been really special to me. In fact, Chris, you'll be aware of this, and Satch, you're keenly aware. We're having the Flying 11 of Ray Hendrick's car, a replica of it, and actually it was one of his cars at the track Thursday night. It'll be on display, and it'll make a ceremonial lap before the race. So it's always been a great. It's a true race car. Let's just put it that way. It's a true race car.
Satch, you were voted one of the top 50 drivers of all time in the modified series. What do you think it takes to compete at the highest level in modified racing?
Well, it's modified drivers are always traveled some, but they're still pretty much territorial. We got, I learned way back as soon as I got started, that if we stayed here, like running at the stadium and some of them places, you got specialists down there that are really good, but when you go somewhere else, they're not so good, so I think that was part of the deal where we did okay was because we went, I guess we've run on just about every racetrack east of Mississippi from Maine to Florida, and that covers a whole lot of ground, for a modified guy. But really, it's you got to be exposed to those places to, and it's just an infinite amount of difference between every racetrack in the country. I mean, they're all around and they come back to where they start, but it's a lot of difference in them. And I guess if you can get exposed and get to where you can figure out what the difference is and make it work and be successful there, then that's what puts you on the top. You got to be there every week.
All right, Chris, I'm going to ask you this here. We're going to stay on the topic of modifieds. I know you're the director of the Smart Modified Tour. Give us a little rundown of what you guys are trying to accomplish with that tour. And then if you had a wish list of tracks you could add to your schedule, what would they be?
Oh, well, I mean, the modifieds are the best series, period. NASCAR does a really good job with the wheel and modified tour. Of course, Clay and M showcase it. We have probably 6 or 7 of our guys that run weekly with us that go over there and compete against them. Matt Hirschman is great. He competes on, both tours. We have just Bobby Labonte, Ryan Newman. We kicked off North Wilkesboro's return with the Smart Modifieds and put on a great event. It had a great crowd, which we expect a lot bigger crowd Thursday night with the talent and what racing means to Martinsville. But the Smart Modified Tour is basically a sister tour with NASCAR because we're the only ones that keep pretty much the same rules. I just had a conversation with Priest and them this week. They're wanting Tri-Track and Monaco and some of these open modified shows at Stafford to all be consistent because there's 4 tours out there that people can run, but the only 2 that regulate body panels, quarter panels, motors, and everything else with the spec motors is us and NASCAR. And so we just want less of a headache to be able to run both. We want it to be legal because some of what's going on up north is, they're deflecting the side panels. They're, bringing air back to the wings and air dams, and the motors, they're running boosters where us and NASCAR run straight spec motors or built motors with the 390, which equalizes it all. So what we're just trying to do with the tour is give the Southern Modifieds an opportunity to have a platform. They've not had that. It's not been very well received in the South. It's credibility, which is, what I try to bring to every racetrack and every competitor and every driver is, do what you say you're going to do and be credible. No different than what your granddaddy taught you, no different what your dad taught you, and no different than what your granddad passed down. And so that's what we're trying to do with the tour. I mean, look, Clay said it a few minutes ago. I mean, and Satch did. The South and its Mid-Atlantic region has more racetracks than anywhere else in the country, anywhere. And it's done that because that's where racing generated from. And so, I mean, you can go within a 4-hour radius and run 11 different tracks. And so the place everybody in a modified wants to run is Martinsville. I would love to, but let's be honest. NASCAR has their own series, and I totally understand what Clay and M's doing, and we would love to do it. But at the same time, I understand what they're trying to do with their series, sponsors and everything else. That would be a wish list. We have a lot of people calling us. I mean, we Lonesome Pines being sold. I know the owner or the person who's buying it, they want us to run there. Kingsport's knocking down the door for us to run. I mean, Little Rock. I mean, I've been talking to Justin and those guys for 6 months, and they're actually putting up the grandstand for us, to be perfectly honest with you. And we're testing there next Friday. But we will showcase the modifieds because we love it so much. We will showcase our talent and our drivers and our racing compared to anybody, because as Clay pointed out, if you ever witnessed it, and hopefully you'll witness this Thursday at the Speedway, it's ground pounders. It's I can't even fathomly tell you how exciting that car is when it cranks up and when you're sitting in it, because I drove a little bit. I hold the steering wheel is what I tell people. There's no other feeling. It's an overgrown go-kart that has 650 horsepower, and you could actually see everything working in front of you, which is amazing. But they're very skilled drivers that drive these things. One mistake, you wreck, and it hurts, and it costs a lot of money. So it's not only exciting, it's kind of like being in a jet plane out of control each and every lap. And that's the best way I can explain it. So that's kind of the overview of where we're at with the sport. It's growing tremendously. It's doing extremely well. And, look, we just appreciate what, everybody's done for us to give this platform, but can't wait for Thursday night to see these guys Bobby Labonte's going to be there. I mean, you got a field of fields with cars coming. I can't wait to see the race.
It should be a great time. We'll do a couple more questions here, and then I'm going to move on to what I'm calling our rapid fire section. But the first one is, if you guys can touch on, what do you think is the biggest difference surrounding securing sponsorships now versus securing sponsorships 20, 30 years ago? Anybody want to jump in there first? Rhett, go ahead.
I was marketing director for BAM Racing for a number of years. And if you think the competition is fast and furious on the track, it's hard to approach a single company who can afford a racing effort that hasn't been approached by 3 or 4 teams. The sponsorship market is crazy. The viewership, unfortunately, has gone down a little bit, but I think it's back on an uptick. So with what NASCAR has done with the sport, I think it's a great product to watch. So, but compared to what it was, I mean, it was go find a local guy who had a body shop, and I remember the sign painter coming to my dad's shop, and I was so fascinated by painting the signs. And now with wraps and paint schemes change every week. There's some Xfinity cars who literally run a different sponsor every week. There's one in Cup, BJ McLeod. He runs a different sponsor almost every week. Takes a lot of money. NASCAR has moved in the right direction though with this latest car, because the costs are down for the teams, but it's a dog eat dog world for sponsorships for sure.
I'm more I'm not involved at the level that some of these gentlemen are. I'm more involved with what NASCAR is doing with diversity in regards to sponsorship and helping close the cultural gap that exists in NASCAR. Naturally, it can be challenging because depending on which sponsor, which entity, they're looking at targeted consumers. The social media presence piece is huge. But thankfully, there's always new money. And there's new companies, new corporations, technologies playing a big role. And so sponsors can oftentimes feel as though they can they're getting more bang for their buck on a grassroots level. If you think about minorities in motorsports, there are not a lot of entities or third parties that power the motorsport experience for minorities. When I say minorities, I do not just mean African Americans. There's Urban Racing School in Philadelphia that has been doing wonderful work for years. And then there's Wendell Scott Foundation. Like I said, we use race car simulation as our tool, but it's highly competitive. As the world changes and as the world evolves, it gets more competitive. But thankfully, I feel as though the worlds of entertainment and Hollywood are embracing NASCAR more than ever. I see NASCAR blending in all sports. You don't see the flip on it. You'll see NFL doing collaborations with NASCAR. You can see NBA doing some collaboration. You can see that duality, and that's the wonderful thing about NASCAR. I try to provide African American celebrities and entertainers with their first NASCAR experience. Many have never been to a race and don't know the experience. Naturally, when you come to a race, there's a lot to learn and a lot to know. And so I'm learning that sponsors are now beginning to put their dollars towards the pre-race experience in order to hook the consumer and to drive them to events that don't just happen on Sunday, but happen on Thursday, Friday and Saturday.
Well, I think Rhett pointed it out pretty spot on as far as sponsorships now versus what they were back in the day of Purelator on the Wood Brothers, STP on Petty Enterprises, First National City Travelers checks on one of Cale Yarborough's cars. There weren't many, but now, and what, Rhett, probably 20+ million if you wanted to sponsor all year long.
I hear it's 15 million.
Yeah, so it fluctuates, but that's a lot of money, and we're just losing. You talk about sponsors that, well, hardly any team has a sponsor that runs all year. There is one, and the one that did, M&M's, After next week, they're gone. It's just hard to have a sponsor that can pony up that kind of dollars all year long. But to answer your question, Adam, I think the biggest difference now with drivers, years ago, they had to be good behind the wheel. Now they have to be as good in the boardroom as they are behind the wheel. You've got to represent that sponsor because they're paying you 365 days a year, 24 hours a day. They're not paying you just for what you do on a Sunday afternoon. They want you to represent them, and you've got to be able to do it. And for some drivers, that's hard. I mean, drivers are competitive. They want to drive a race car, but most of them realize this is so critical to a race team, to their career. It's changed quite a bit from years ago.
Great, thank you. So, all right, let's go to rapid fire here. So basically, I'm going to ask a question, spit out your answer as quick as you can, all right? Chris, I'm going to start with you. What's the wildest thing you've ever seen in Victory Lane?
Oh, somebody cheating. I'll quickly, it's supposed to be rapid fire,
Yeah,
right?
sure, go ahead.
I seen somebody actually do something to the car and they got caught and they got suspended. I mean, it was pretty blatant.
Satch, wildest thing you've ever seen in Victory Lane?
Rapid fire is not too good here. Nothing wild when I was involved, but most everything we were ever involved was pretty upfront. It's weekly shows and weekly people. So wasn't anything real wild on that part. My best.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Rock race champion.
Yep.
Probably.
Yep. Yeah, we won in the last race champions at Pocono.
Yeah, exactly.
Yep.
That's a good one.
That was my big one.
I'll make this as quick as possible, and I'll give you a little tidbit of information. You can look on TV this weekend and maybe see it. Maybe not the wildest, but one of the most memorable was Dale Earnhardt Jr.'s last victory here. And for those of you who don't know, our Victory Lane is on a flatbed trailer. We bring it out to the start finish line, and the backdrop's on it, and the driver and the crew gets on it. They were jumping up and down so much. I mean, I've never seen a celebration and a happier driver and team as they were that almost night. But the tidbit of information I'll give you, going back to the clock, we've got the skinniest guy on our maintenance department standing behind that clock, holding it up so it won't fall over when people jump up and down on the trailer. So maybe you might see him. You look real close, and if you see him, then that's not good because he's not supposed to be seen, but he's back there holding the clock up.
Well, he didn't say it had to be personal experience. So the wildest thing I've seen in Victory Lane was an IndyCar race. I told you I'm a race fan. When AJ Foyt backhanded Ari Lyondike. That's the one that sticks out for me.
Wildest thing, Denny and Logano. Denny and Joey Logano when they got into that dust up in Martinsville. I mean, here. That was seeing some wild stuff, but we know when Denny gets upset, who knows? Crap shit.
Yeah, we found that out last year, right?
Right.
All right, Clay, real quick, this isn't rapid fire, but if you can, give us the story behind the famous Martinsville hot dog. And at what point did you realize, hey, we got a tradition here?
Well, I didn't, and Warrick said it right. It's a Jesse Jones hot dog. So that started years and years ago, and most of you are familiar with go to a ball game. You get a hot dog, there's nothing on it. You go over here to the condiment stand and put everything that you want on it. Here, it's made fresh. It's mustard, chili, onion, slaw, unless you want to change it. So it's just that's just why it's special. We actually it's so special, and people really love that thing. So on a good weekend, we will sell probably 60,000 hot dogs, and we did a little deal to figure out how many laps the hot dogs would go around the track. I can't remember how many it was, but it's amazing how iconic that hot dog is. And we changed it one time. 2 times actually. Chris, am I taking
Yeah,
your-
I was
your
going
thunder?
there. Go ahead.
So let me give you a quick story on that.
You
So-
tell them who called you.
Yeah, well, the year before we changed it, the racetrack came up in turn 3. We had a hole in turn 3. This was cup race. So I get a call from the tower and they say, how about going to the elevator, pick up Helton and go down on the track and see what's going on? My heart just dropped to my feet. That's not a good thing to be told, go pick up the president of NASCAR and go down the track and see what's going on. All the cars were stopped. All of our track service vehicles are over there. So go down there and yeah, it was a big chunk of concrete up. It went through Jeff Gordon's grill. So obviously he was not a happy camper.
Was that a piece that you had laid?
Allegedly. Allegedly. Actually, yes. Yes, that is true. I did. So it went through his grill. He wasn't a happy camper. Dale Earnhardt Jr. didn't bother him. He came up, he said, just put a cone up, we'll go around it. Honest to God, that's what he said. Put a cone up and we'll drive around it. So anyway, moving forward 12 months, we changed hot dogs. And this was a new caterer that was part of International Speedway Corporation who owned the Speedway. So we changed, and that didn't go over well at all. I mean, usually you've heard the tale of drivers going to the big red hauler after a race to either raise cane or get cane raised to them one way or the other. They were going to the hauler that morning complaining they've changed the hot dog. It was more turmoil over changing the hot dog than it was the track coming up the year before. And that's the honest truth. The guy that was a president of the catering company, he called me. He said, if Mr. France calls you, tell him I've got boots on the ground. We're correcting it. It'll be fixed before lunchtime. Please tell him. I mean, he was worried about his job and he's worried about Mr. France finding out about it and, booting him. But they did get it corrected, but it was, we'll never do that again.
All right, so back to the rapid fire here. What are the most hot dogs you've ever consumed during a race weekend? Chris, you got a microphone.
I'm not going to say how many I had, but Dale Earnhardt would average 14 a day. I would go get them for him, and he wouldn't let nobody eat them but himself. So mine's probably 4. That's about it.
Mine probably topped out to 6. I couldn't eat a lot before a race, so it's after the race.
Probably 2 for me. I don't eat on race weekend. too wound up.
Maybe 4.
I say 6.
Okay. Are y'all being honest or this allegedly?
It just depends on how long I'm at the race.
Okay.
If I'm there multiple days, it's multiple hot dogs.
All right. Besides Martinsville, what's your favorite track to watch a race? Either TV or in person, doesn't matter.
Favorite track. I like Daytona, man. I like Daytona.
All right, we'll just work back the line this way.
Definitely Daytona, especially Daytona 500 because of prestige. However, honorable mention to Indy, the oval, not the road course.
Daytona.
Yeah, I take Daytona. It's got everything.
Daytona, no doubt.
All right. Got a winner there, huh? All right, Chris, I'll start with you. We'll just go right back. For someone who's attending their first race this weekend, what's something you tell them to watch for that the average person may not pay attention to?
Actually, where everybody parks, it's a game at Martinsville, and Martinsville is one of those. Everybody's coming, and you're fitting 65,000 people, and everybody has a game, including the drivers, and it's kind of fun to watch. I've heard all the stories. Bob Labonte used to dress up in Mark Martin's clothes to go up the street to get in the car, and people park over there back behind Wendy's or the Speedway, and the game getting out is pretty fun. But there's no bad experience at Martinsville. I mean, to be perfectly honest with you, it's my home track, but when everybody goes, I go all the races across the country, and they ask me where I live in Martinsville, and immediately they talk about hot dogs, and they talk about that's the only track that there's something going on every lap that's not being seen on TV. It could be happening 15th to 18th to 20th. And so there's excitement. And so, hey, just enjoy the event. It's a great pleasure to be in Martinsville and to just enjoy it.
Satch, one thing an average person may not pay attention to while watching a race that you would say, hey, you should watch this.
Well, I don't know. you got to be a race car driver, I think, or be exposed to it to see things, especially on the bigger tracks, like you can't, people just see cars going around, and you got to be able to see this little move, that little move. I guess I catch myself telling my wife at home when we watching the race the last few weeks, say, well, he got him right there and he ain't even passed him yet, but he got him, and so that's the thing. It's hard to put a good explanation out there, but I guess once you've seen enough of it, it comes to you.
I think Chris hit it right on the head. Don't get fixated on watching the leader or any other driver. Look at the whole track, because something's going on all day long around the whole racetrack. So if you get fixated on one aspect of it, you'll probably miss something somewhere else. But it's action packed, and that's why fans love coming here. It's just something going on all day long.
If you're going to Martinsville this Sunday, and you should be going to Martinsville this Sunday, get a scanner. Look for any kind of controversy. If someone knocks someone else out, but they're still in the race, put it on their put it on their channel and watch them, because they are ticked off and trying to get back to that driver. And you'll hear the spotter trying to talk them down. Hey, don't do anything stupid now. Don't. It's hysterical to watch. And then after the race, watch them confront each other. So plenty to watch.
I would say if you're at the race, before the race, if you're not watching from TV, I always look at the pit crews and how they prepare. They practice running on to the track. So I always just try to see who's more nimble, with some communications going on, some eye rolling is happening and things of that nature. So watch the pit crews. When those guys pit, hey man, one false move and you could sink the ship.
All right, Clay, this one's specifically for you. So let me finish the whole thing, okay? In 2016, Bristol hosted a football game between Virginia Tech and Tennessee. I was lucky enough to go. It was probably the best sporting atmosphere I've ever been a part of. So come on, Clay, what are the chances of a football game at Martinsville?
Probably maybe a little higher than 0.
So you're telling me there's a chance, right?
We're in the racing business, so that's where we'll stick. But honestly, Bristol, they've got the scoreboard that goes over the track now. I don't think they did at that point, but we've got buildings right in the center. We've got a garage that Bristol doesn't have. So we've got so many buildings that they would have to level to even put a field in there. So yeah, it probably won't happen. And I can tell you another thing won't happen. It ain't going back to dirt.
I like that. We'll start here and work down. Chris, you mentioned North Wilkesboro. The big announcement the other month is NASCAR returning to North Wilkesboro next year for the All-Star race. Very excited. Should be a great time. Besides North Wilkesboro, what's one track you'd love to see NASCAR return to?
Well, I mean, not too many's went away. I mean, you talk about Jacksonville or you talk about some of the older tracks, but look, I mean, I'm kind of partial to short tracks because I mean it's exciting. I mean, I call the mid tracks cookie cutters, which they've been running a little bit better this year with the new car, but the new car is made totally different, right? And I kind of laugh because Rockingham went away because of the market. SMI took away Wilkesboro because they were taking it to New Hampshire, and it was a difference of about $90 million, not only to the track, but the industry. So there's reasons why they went away. But it's kind of circled back. It's kind of like your old clothes, right? It always comes back, the bell bottoms or the flares or whatever. Wilkesboro was really fun to be a part of, bringing it back. The racing was exciting. I'm glad they're not tearing the racetrack up. But I think, Rockingham's going to come back to a certain extent. I don't know if Cup will be there, but I think you'll see trucks or Xfinity or something else. I don't really know. I mean, there's not been too many that's went away, since the 70s. And so, I think Clay, I mean, he's involved in it more than anybody. And, I mean, Fontana's getting ready to change. It's getting ready to go to a short track, which it needed something, right? And I know you was instrumental in some of that. And I think the ideas in that were great. But me personally, I want action. You know, I want a little bit about them getting a little upset because somebody rubbed them wrong or whatever, because that's what we all like to see in a competitive nature. And it doesn't matter if it's NBA, football. But look, I think the sport has come back. I think that grassroots racing has come back, and something's changed since the pandemic. And I mean, you know, I'm not probably a big fan of the major change in the car, because we all sit in a room, we have our opinion. You know, I think the one lug's kind of difficult to work around. I think the actuators on the bottom and the tires. I mean, I think if, you know, NASCAR would continue to grow that and change that a little bit, I think it could be much better. And let's be honest, it needs to be much safer. I'm friends with all the drivers. I've represented them for years, and I hear a lot about what that's going on. But I just think short tracks are here to stay. I think that the sport is growing tremendously. And look, I'm glad Wilkesboro's back, not just for the community of Wilkes County, but for the competitors that hadn't had a chance to race on it now get a chance. So that's kind of how I look at it.
Satch, do you have a track? I mean, and let me rephrase that. It could be past or present. Is there a track you'd love to see NASCAR run on that they're not currently running on?
Well, I got several, but you know, we back in the late 70s, early 80s, I was driving for Speedy Thomas over here in Collinsville, and we won 5 in a row at North Wilkesboro, and I was really glad to see that come back, because it was just something about that racetrack. It works, you know. I mean, the pavement's 100 years old, you know, but it's still there, you know. Everything works. And then, but it's been that way all over the country, because you know, the modifieds have always run a race of champions, you know, ever since I started. But they've moved the thing around over the country, you know. And years ago, you know, you had to go to Langhorne, Pennsylvania, they went to run the race champions. Then they moved it to Trenton, New Jersey, and then they went to Pocono. And you know, we won the race of champions at the last race at Pocono, and it was on the 3/4 mile track. It wasn't on the big track, but that was, you know, that was always a big deal, because I mean, you know, the race of champions, for the years that I always ran, drew a field of like 140 race cars trying to make the field, you know. And that was pretty big deal, you know. But I just kind of miss those tracks that, you know, you don't have races with that many cars coming anymore. And it's just, it's sort of a loss, in my opinion.
Clay, you got one?
Yeah, actually, it's a semi answer. I'd like to see them run Atlanta Motor Speedway again. Now, you're saying they run Atlanta Motor Speedway now, but once SMI bought it years ago, they made it, as Chris said, a cookie cutter with the dog leg in the front stretch. I really love the oval track they had years ago. I think that was better racing than what we have now. So in a way, they're running Atlanta now, but not the track I'd like to see. I'd like to see that come back.
I'd love to see them run the oval at Indy, but my vote would go for Nashville Fairgrounds. And I think that's probably coming. So something to look forward to.
I would say I saw my grandfather race twice. I saw him race in Callaway and Hickory. So, yeah, I'd like to see some action in Hickory.
All right. Well, we're going to open it up to a couple audience questions here. Does anybody have one? They're just dying to get answered here. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I tell you, there's a lot of things that a lot of people can do. One, volunteer for a team that's already out there, you local. I mean, we have racing every week in the modifieds, and they're looking for people to help, right? And to be honest with you, if you're there and you exert yourself at that level, you'll be surprised how many people move into a different series. There's some tech centers. NASCAR Institute has a tech center that if you're interested in engines or stuff of that nature, you can go to school there. Patrick Henry Community College right here has a great program. Talmadge Thomas runs it. Talmadge does a really good job. He works, with Chris Fleming and them, and it's local. I mean, you can do just different classes and stuff. But they let you build the car. I was over there 2 weeks ago and actually sat through a class just to watch the process of them. And there's a lot of people right now in these technical institutes and these local colleges have classes to do that. And I say, number one, be around your local racer and go over to the shop and volunteer to clean it up, because the next thing you'll do is be putting a tire together. Next thing you'll be doing is putting air in it. Next thing you'll be doing is things you never thought you would do. And every one of us, I mean, every one of us was around a race car somewhere along the line or around something that we were forced to do because our parents or the people that we were there, and we learned because we were forced to, because we had to do it. And it was our way of life. You just got to make it your way of life. That's the way I look at it.
I'd like to add that whatever you choose to do, don't forget the power of yes, sir, and no, sir, yes, ma'am, and no, ma'am. Show up first, be prepared to leave last. And like my father always says, be a sponge. All the knowledge that's around you, just soak it up every time. And if you prove that you're reliable and you're hardworking, and also you know how to hear and not hear and see and not see, because you're around grown men, you'll be elevated in the sport. You just got to dedicate yourself.
Some of the best advice I ever got was no matter who pays your paycheck, ultimately you work for yourself. So what that means is whatever kind of habits you develop, people see that. I used to work for a race team, BAM Racing. I was the marketing director, and then I did PR, and we had unpaid interns. Great way for people to get exposure in the sport. It didn't cost us anything. It was free help. So if there are local teams, even things like cutting their grass for them, just show them that you're willing to bust your tail to be involved. And that means something. Someone who shows up all the time and will work, believe me, you'll go places.
I really couldn't add anything more to what these guys have said, but whatever you do, just work ethic. It's hard to get good workers now. Show that you have that desire, you have that drive. If they get you sweeping the shop floor, be the best sweeper they've ever had. That's it. And they'll see that you want to go someplace, and that's what it takes. It's just basically you gotta work. And Warrick said it nicely. You gotta be respectful to who you're working for. But if you show that you want to be the best at whatever you do, and work your way, like Chris said, work your way on up the ladder, you'll make it.